Alejandro's family was as ordinary as can be. And there was nothing wrong with that. That was their whole existence. His father worked as a storekeeper at the local factory. The pay was decent, though not sky high. His mother was a housewife who occasionally did sewing work from home to earn extra money. This family had enough money for a decent living and to provide their two children with everything they needed. Little Fina was in the third grade of elementary school. She was a very active and playful girl with cunning gray eyes. She loved going to art exhibitions and helping her mother cut out patterns for clothes, but she loved her older brother even more. Sandro was a student in middle school, and next year he was supposed to move up to high school. He was more composed compared to his sister, but it would be hard to call him a bore. He was just older, that's all. The boy loved spending his free time playing video games. Considering the extracurricular activities he took at school and his CrossFit training, he didn't spend too much time on the computer. On the contrary, such gaming sessions benefited him. The thing was, only in the game could he freely communicate with people. His classmates seemed too silly to him, and other peers annoyed him with their irresponsibility and desire to follow the trends. However, at that time, he didn't yet realize what communication difficulties awaited him in the future. The parents suddenly announced that they were moving. It turns out they had been thinking for a long time that two children of different genders shouldn't share a room, so they postponed buying a new apartment. Of course, they still had to take out a mortgage, but they already had a certain financial cushion by that time. The new neighborhood was much better. There were no dilapidated buildings, small 24-hour pubs, or other signs of a troubled area. The new housing development was more suitable for comfortable family living. And logically, the local school was better. Alejandro wasn't too upset about it, but it couldn't be said about Fina. She had many friends left at her old school. "Mommy, what about Tia? How can I leave them with Carla? They're constantly fighting without me," the girl cried. "I like this school, I don't want another one." The parents sincerely tried to support her, explaining that in the new class, she would have the opportunity to make new friends. Moreover, the magnificent playground right outside the windows of the apartment building contributed to the emergence of a new circle of acquaintances, where children of different ages played every day. Sandro liked the new school. The kids here weren't clingy, nobody forced him to make friends or join a group. He was left to his own devices, and he definitely liked it. The studies went smoothly. At some point, it seemed to him that it was too easy. However, the teachers gave a perfectly logical answer to such an assumption. Alejandro turned out to be a very capable boy. At the end of the first semester, the parents were offered to transfer him to a specialized class. Of course, no one refused the opportunity to provide the child with a better education. "Son, this is such a blessing. You're just amazing, being one of the best in such a good school," his mother repeated with undisguised pride on the day the principal called them. And from that moment, something definitely went wrong. You could only get into the specialized class either through good grades or through well-off parents. And here, the second option prevailed. The rich kids immediately understood what was what. On the very first day, they swarmed around him like flies around a drop of honey. They scrutinized him, observed his actions, making conclusions that only they understood. He stood out from the other kids. Sandro was noticeable for his modesty, an old model phone, simple clothes. In their eyes, the newcomer was just a regular nerd who couldn't stand up for himself. And with such conclusions drawn, Alejandro's tough days began, during which he had nothing else to do but endure the bullying. Of course, he talked to his parents about what was happening. It was impossible to escape attention to the shabby clothes or torn textbooks. But Sandro understood everything perfectly well. "Mom, it's nothing," he justified himself to the concerned woman. "Teenagers are stupid. I know this school is good, and I won't have another chance to get such a diploma. Son, we can transfer you to a school in the neighboring district." She pressed the crumpled kitchen towel to her chest, trying to shake off the trembling of anxiety. "No diploma is more valuable to me than your own health. Maybe we can go to the principal, discuss this situation." The father, who had been sitting quietly in the chair next to the open window all this time, put the cigarette on the edge of the ashtray. He frowned, looking at his wife, coughed into his fist, and sternly said, "All right, you go to the principal, tell him about the bad kids who are bullying your son." He made a meaningful pause. "And have you thought about how they'll treat Sandro later? Like mommy's boy, a snitch, a wimp. Teenagers only get tougher when adults interfere in their affairs. Let him handle it himself, like a real man. He's already made his decision to stay. No need for mom to hover around and pick up snot for the child." The boy looked at his father, feeling mixed emotions. On one hand, he wanted to thank him for supporting his point of view. But on the other, Sandro's opinion about teenagers seemed pessimistic. It was even a bit hurtful to hear his words about what the guys might think of him for trying to ask for help. Can't they all be so mean, right? Alejandro lowered his head. Of course, he felt terribly uncomfortable in the new class, but was it worth expressing it so harshly? And you'd better give them a good answer. You only need to show the pack of jackals your teeth once, and they'll scatter, the man added sharply before reaching for the cigarette again. So won't they just keep going with renewed vigor if we resist? It seems to me it will only provoke them more, Sandro muttered, rubbing his shoulder where a fresh bruise still throbbed. It's hopeless. Can't struggle, can't endure, can't even call the adults. What can we do? We could give one of them a good smack in the face too. Enough of that. His wife interrupted him. Kids nowadays are made of a completely different fabric. Force doesn't work against them. Sooner or later, they'll even report us to the police. Their parents are rolling in money. It's easy for them to paint our boy as guilty. I'm telling you, let's transfer him to another school, and that's the end of it. And I'm telling you, the boy has the right to decide which school he wants to attend, a good one or an ordinary one. And our son has made his choice. If he doesn't know how to solve his problems, then let him endure. He'll endure until he's had enough, come to some conclusions, and put on a show for all of them. The woman was relentless. A mother's heart ached at the thought of someone harming her child. She was silent for a minute, then continued to press her husband. Then where are the teachers looking? You answered your own question. The parents have a lot of money, so their kids can do anything. These brats have a field day while the children of ordinary workers get the short end of the stick. Those teachers couldn't care less about what happens to a simple boy. All these arguments were followed by hours of quarreling. The parents rarely quarreled, so Sandro felt doubly guilty. He didn't like being the cause of the argument. The boy sighed heavily and headed to his room. Even from there, he could hear fragments of the bickering adults' phrases. They both only talked about how Alejandro couldn't handle things on his own. But he didn't argue with that assertion. Asking to leave him in this school, he perfectly understood that the bullying would continue, that they wouldn't have enough money to deal with these kids. He understood that he was leaving himself in a dead end. The quality of education stood before him higher than honor. This approach to setting priorities distinguished him from his peers. His team friends supported him in every possible way, and that was enough for Alejandro. He knew he wasn't alone in this world and that there were people, not his family, who cared about him. With the proper support, he could endure the remaining few years. And at school, everything went on as usual. As soon as Sandro entered the classroom, all attention was drawn to him. The boy barely had time to sit down before the first bullies approached him. "Hey, nerd," a girl with quite provocative makeup spat out, "will you let me copy the homework?" Without waiting for an answer, she grabbed Sandro's notebook and tried to pull it towards her. But as soon as the owner sharply snatched it from her hands and put it back in place, the bully's face changed. "Did you not understand me? That wasn't a question, you idiot." She grabbed the notebook by the edge and tried to drag it away again. "Sit still and don't move until your bones are intact." Alejandro was distracted from his phone, lifted his head, and with a determined look in his eyes, he slammed his hand down on the notebook. The sound of the impact made the surrounding people jump, freezing in anticipation of a show. Waiting for Lucia to just open her mouth to say something, the guy started speaking first. "Look, your lackeys and henchmen are breaking my bones. Daddy covers for you with the police. You get satisfaction and remain happy." He couldn't believe the confident tone he suddenly spoke with. "And then what? What's in it for me? Bones will heal, bruises will fade, we'll pay the medical bills. So what's the point in the end? You've been pushing for who knows what for half a year already. What's your end game?" For a moment, Lucia was stunned. Sandro had never tried to oppose anyone before. Quickly realizing that with every passing second her authority among her classmates was diminishing, the girl began to improvise. "There's no endgame," she laughed in Sandro's face. "You're just so pathetic that you're begging for a beating. Look at your stupid face, loser. You don't belong here at all. Consider it our duty to constantly remind you of that." The lackeys laughed along with their ringleader and dispersed to their seats. Alejandro surveyed everyone present with a gaze full of anger and disappointment. Apparently, they really enjoyed their impunity. Father was right, he needed to at least try to defend himself. Then he would have some relief and could pull his pride out of the mud they had trampled it into. Meanwhile, little Fina quickly made friends with her new class. They often gathered in the schoolyard and spent time together. Overall, the girl's worries were unfounded. She had indeed found new friends. But one thing saddened her childish heart. During breaks, she often saw her older brother being bullied. Sandro strictly forbade his sister from approaching him at such times. He didn't want these hyenas to target his sister too. And Serafina didn't want him to be sad. However, her desire to support her brother in everything prevented her from disobeying his prohibitions, and the girl often only watched with sad eyes. One day, Mom tasked Fina with delivering Sandro's lunch, which he had forgotten on the table in the morning. Feeling her little responsibility, the girl ran to his class with a skip in her step. Her shiny, curly dark chocolate-colored hair fluttered in the wind from her brisk pace. She burst into the open classroom door and stopped on the threshold, scanning the room with her eyes to find her brother. Fina spotted his desk but couldn't see him anywhere. "Hey, are you lost or something?" Lucia unusually kindly asked. "Maybe I can escort you to the right class." "No, I'm looking for my little brother. Mom said to give him his lunch." "Did he step out somewhere?" The teenagers exchanged glances. Their faces lit up with predatory smiles as they swiftly closed in on the girl, as if surrounding her. "Oh, so you're Sandro's sister." Alejandro returned to the classroom. He had gone to the restroom, completely unaware that his sister had been sent to him. The closer he got to the door, the stronger an unsettling feeling grew in his chest, as if a foreboding. He had become so accustomed to the atmosphere in the classroom that he had grown accustomed to this feeling, but this time something was definitely off. Entering the classroom, he saw a disgusting sight. His sister was wailing at the top of her lungs, with lettuce leaves and chicken pieces stuck in her thick hair. Next to her, Julio stood giggling uncontrollably, holding an empty paper food bag. Sandro's fists involuntarily clenched at the sight. "Sandro," the little girl pleaded tearfully, "Sandro, tell them. Make them stop, big brother." But Sandro remained silent. Out of anger, he clenched his jaw so tightly that his tense jaw muscles were visible to the naked eye. He ignored everyone except Julio. He stared directly into his insolent, mocking eyes. Instead of loud confrontations, he approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. "Let's talk." There was so much steel in that short phrase that the taunters momentarily reduced their smiles. Julio, eyeing Sandro, involuntarily snickered. The thing was, Alejandro had always been this gentle giant. A tall, well-built guy who never engaged in open confrontation. And such an offer to talk no longer sounded pitiful or funny. But there was no backing down. His reputation in the class was at stake. Behind the two boys, whispering quietly to each other, the other participants of the bullying slowly crept closer. "Brother, where are you going? Don't leave." "Wait for me here, don't worry, Finney," said the older brother, and before leaving, he just took out wet wipes from his bag and handed them to his sister. The girl nodded silently. In such moments, she trusted her brother more than anyone else. There had been similar situations in the old school, and she knew perfectly well how it could end. Just as she knew she didn't want to watch it. The procession went out into the courtyard. Teachers, seeing the heated crowd of teenagers passing by, immediately rushed to the principal's office, sensing trouble. But nobody followed them. Many of the teachers just watched the situation from the windows. The teaching staff, for the most part, consisted of women who wouldn't be able to do anything or might even get hurt themselves. Once Sandro and Julio were a bit away from the crowd, Sandro roughly grabbed Julio by the collar and pushed him away so that he stood a couple of steps opposite. This action was immediately accompanied by cheerful laughter, and the bully, carefully hiding his fears, feigned a smirk. Alejandro watched him from under his brows, continuing to maintain his iron silence. "So what are you going to do, nerd? Burn a hole in me with your malicious stare?" Julio smirked, though his voice trembled. "Maybe you want to find out?" The opponent let out a haughty laugh, taking just 2 steps towards Alejandro. His final 2 steps. It all happened very quickly, only a dull thud and the rustle of clothes could be heard. It was a precise, well-placed blow, landing squarely on the guy's jaw, and that was enough. Julio clumsily collapsed to the ground, executing a strange pirouette beforehand. "What?" Lucia squealed in utter disbelief, a sentiment shared by all present. The teenagers exchanged bewildered looks. None of them had even considered the possibility that the school introvert could pull off something like this. Mingo emerged from the crowd, cautiously eyeing the victor. It seemed like he was heading towards his friend, but Sandro wasn't concerned. He shifted his weight onto his legs and forcefully pushed Domingo with his chest, sending him flying. Adrenaline still pulsed through his veins, and Alejandro was ready to continue if needed. But the bystanders understood the situation and had no desire to approach. Sandro approached them himself, and the crowd immediately parted, allowing him to make his way back to the school. However, instead of doing so, he positioned himself so that everyone could hear and see him. "Do whatever you want with me," his voice was unusually loud and deep, "but lay a hand on my sister, and I'll break every one of your faces, and no amount of money will fix them. Clear?" Alejandro glanced at his fist. The skin was slightly peeled on the knuckles, with small droplets of blood welling at the edges. After all, nobody knew that before he got into CrossFit, back in elementary school, he used to box, even winning all the top places in his age group. But nobody asked. To them, Sandro was just a big quiet guy. Now, all his classmates would know their boundaries. The director, a middle-aged man with a touch of gray at his temples, was already rushing to the scene. "What is this supposed to mean? What are you doing here?" He pushed through the crowd, and upon reaching the center of the circle, immediately saw 2 boys lying on the ground and Sandro with an injured hand a little away from them. "You? And where are you going?" "You're the top student." "My sister is in the 5th classroom, where someone spilled food from her lunchbox all over her. She's in hysterics, and now her clothes are all dirty," he growled angrily, "so while everyone's doing whatever they're doing, I'm going to her." Somewhere in the background, Julio began to moan in pain, gradually coming to his senses. Meanwhile, Alejandro ignored the director's angry remarks, walking past him. As he had mentioned earlier, he needed to get back to his little sister. He planned to deal with all the consequences the next day. For today, his schooling was over. After retrieving his sister from the classroom, he escorted her to the foyer and then went to her classroom, where he gathered her belongings and briefly explained the situation to her teacher. The principal intercepted him at the entrance. Instead of a disciplinary conversation in his office, Sandro suggested they talk while they walked with his sister to the school gates. Despite his apparent dissatisfaction, the man agreed. Seeing Serafina's condition, as a father of 2 daughters himself, he felt sympathy towards her. He couldn't imagine what he would do in his student's place. On the way out of the school grounds, he also learned about the prolonged bullying towards Sandro, which came as a real revelation to him. Apparently, the teachers didn't want to raise any extra fuss, which led to such incidents. However, recalling Alejandro's classmates' parents, he himself didn't want to stir up trouble. The boy's motives were clear to him. He warned the boy that he would have to call his parents anyway, to which the boy silently nodded. That's where they parted ways. At home, his parents were already waiting for him. While his mother was extremely displeased with the news, his father proudly smiled. "Here he is, my man. Came home as a winner. Look, Fina, you should hang out with boys like him. No trouble is scary with such a lad around." "Shut it, old donkey," the woman snapped at him, swinging a towel. "Our son got into a fight, and he's sitting there rejoicing. Weren't you the one convincing me not to touch those rich kids? And now what?" The father grinned mischievously. Such a smirk on his face could only be seen when he felt like an absolute winner. He chuckled, settled comfortably into his chair, and began to explain. "While you were running around the kitchen like a headless chicken right after the director, the scoundrel's father called me. A decent man, I must say." He chuckled again, earning another hit from the kitchen towel. "They won't do anything to our Sandro. The gentleman won't press any charges, said our boy acted in good conscience. He even praised him for such a precise punch. They'll only ask us to cover Julio's hospital bill. Sandro went a bit overboard with his strength, so that idiot will be wearing a bandage for the next 2 weeks. You hear that, son? You dislocated his jaw." The father burst into mocking laughter, so hearty that he didn't even pay attention to his wife's hits and complaints. Once she calmed down a bit, the woman turned to their son. She gave him a stern look and stood up, hands on her hips. "We'll pay from your pocket money, all right, son?" "Fine," the boy muttered indifferently, then went to his room. For several days at school, everything was quiet. The teenagers were still discussing the incident in the yard, while Julio, with a bandage on his head, silently drilled his enemy with his gaze. It was total humiliation. What he had asked for, a provocation, could hardly even be called a fight. Moreover, as a result, he not only lost but ended up in the hospital. Julio nursed a grudge against this hothead. Meanwhile, Sandro, quietly, began to enjoy the calm atmosphere in class. 3 days later, Serafina disappeared. Sandro and Serafina often finished their lessons at different times. But the school was literally around the corner from home, so no one thought that anything could happen to the girl in just 5 minutes. One day, she simply didn't return from class. Her phone was unreachable. No one saw what happened. The parents immediately reported their daughter missing. Alejandro was shattered. He looked even gloomier, and his skin took on a gray hue. Besides his gaming friends, he had no one to share his grief with. His mother was struck by the tragedy. His father began to disappear frequently, coming home with a strong smell of alcohol. At home, he couldn't find solace. He also had to comfort his mother and help her around the house. The woman could no longer sew clothes. Every time she took the patterns in her hands, she remembered how her little girl sat next to her and helped. Money in the family was dwindling. The father drank. He became violent, constantly discontented, and even aggressive. He started skipping work, not even bothering to cover up his absences. The police reassured the family, promising that they would return their daughter to them any moment now. But it never happened, not after a week, not after a month. Serafina simply vanished. At school, Sandro's classmates quickly noticed the changes in him. His clothes looked even cheaper, and sometimes he came dressed inappropriately for the weather. But what interested the teenagers more was the total indifference with which the once popular guy began to treat all the teasing. "Hey, nerd, scared for your fate?" Lucia asked him one day. "Decided to stop teasing, huh? It's the right thing to do. You just got lucky with Julio's father." Sandro gave her an empty look, then lowered his head again, staring at the desk. This scenario definitely didn't please the girl. She snorted, then forcefully pointed her finger at the boy's forehead, forcing him to raise his head and look at her. Are you completely out of your mind? I'm talking to you. Don't you dare ignore me. Can I ask you for something? Lucia raised her right eyebrow in surprise. A request? From him to her? It sounded intriguing, and finally, the boy reacted. The girl crossed her elegant arms over her chest, as if showing by her appearance that she was granting him the right to speak. Disappear. Lucia burst into laughter. Her reaction was immediately echoed by everyone who was watching and heard their conversation. Among them was Julio, whose headband had long been removed. The guy stood up from his seat and, with a slow, languid gait, began to move towards Sandro's desk. Buddy, looks like you've gained some courage, he began amidst arrogant laughter. Our last conversation didn't end very nicely, but I think you need a refresher on how to communicate with your classmates. What do you think? Maybe it's time for a rematch. Sandro? Alejandro smoothly shifted his gaze to Juan now. He sighed heavily. So your dad can send us another hospital bill afterward? No, thanks. Julio's eyes narrowed, his face slightly reddened, as stifled laughter rippled among the classmates. He noticed the slender guy sitting in the front row, who was watching the interaction between the two adversaries with undisguised interest, though he seemed reluctant to laugh at Julio. Hey, Chus, Julio called out, could you step outside for a moment? The boy grinned when the taunter addressed him. He already had an idea of what was about to happen, so he immediately got up and briskly walked towards the exit. Sandro, as expected, remained calm. He had no interest in his classmates' antics, all his thoughts were directed towards little Fina. The bitterness of loss outweighed the feeling of trampled pride. And now, my friends, the show begins. Julio announced loudly, jumping onto the neighboring desk. Your faithful servant will now demonstrate the wonders of dog training. Right, Sandro? You are a humble mutt from the poor neighborhoods, needing to learn proper behavior in civilized society. Anger slowly boiled in Alejandro's chest, but he had no strength to resist. He just wanted nobody to notice his existence, to leave him alone, to ignore him, to boycott him. Anything, as long as he could be left alone with his thoughts. But Julio persisted. He jumped off the desk and forcefully snatched Sandro's backpack from the back of his chair. Sandro didn't bother reaching out to grab the strap, he knew they would return it eventually. He was used to this. And the first command for today is fetch. Sandro suddenly looked up, and the last thing he managed to notice was his backpack flying out of the open classroom window. He got up, the chair crashing aside, and everyone present immediately burst into laughter. Julio had already assumed a defensive stance, ready this time to receive Sandro's blows. And then, from the open window, Chus's voice rang out. Hey, Julio. Look here. The guy glanced briefly in Sandro's direction, who hadn't taken any active actions yet, and approached the window. There, the boy was waving one of the flyers that spilled out of Alejandro's open backpack during its flight. In the classroom, there was a grave silence. Sandro sat in his seat again, this time glowering at one of the flyers. The text read, "Have you seen this girl?" with Serafina's photograph printed in the middle. Below was a description of her appearance and the last day she was seen in the area. No one felt like joking anymore. Everyone held these flyers, remembering the day they decided to tease Fina. You. How are you? Julio asked, his voice tinged with guilt. Why didn't you speak up? Sandro bitterly smirked. He pulled his sweater sleeve over his wrist and wiped his moist eyes. It seems we're far from being friends enough to share such things with each other. That's true, but we're still human, right? Are we? I haven't noticed anything human in you over these past 6 months. Teenagers cringed at this remark and averted their eyes. You bullied me, and then you went after my sister. All because my parents aren't businessmen. Does that set me apart from being human? Or perhaps you think you're acting humanely. Listen, buddy. I'm not your buddy, okay? It's pointless. If your conscience has awakened, it's better to just leave me alone. and his request was granted. The next day, no one approached him. Some even started greeting him. But Julio and Lucia, as the most incorrigible troublemakers, feared crossing paths with him again. Sandro sighed with relief. The day passed without fuss, but when he returned home, a real surprise awaited him. In the living room, there were about 10 adults, with several more in the kitchen. Sandro had seen them all before at school. They were the parents of some of his classmates. Bags of groceries stood in the corridor. It was unclear why anyone would need so much food. Among these bags were also bags of clothes. The boy watched the whole procession, unable to understand what was happening. "Son, here you are," his mother said affectionately, clearly having cried for a long time before he arrived. "These gentlemen found out about Fina. They came to help us." "So you went around showing my son's face," one of the men said menacingly, then, contrary to everything, laughed. "Now that's a fighter. My boy needed a good shakeup for a long time. I have to give you credit. After spending 2 weeks with a muzzle, he did become calmer. Sorry for the hospital bill, but I couldn't just let my rascal be. Right? And so, it's fair. He gets a dislocation and a reason to think about his behavior next time, while you get minor sanctions and a reason to try avoiding a fight next time. My daughter brought home one of the flyers from school. They told us that after school, you quietly plastered them around the city. It's amazing how not a single one of them ever caught our eye," added the woman sympathetically, who looked like his classmate Adela as 2 drops of water. "You had to go through so much because of our children. Assistance with searches, with money, all of it, the least we can do to atone for their guilt." After these words, Alejandro's mother became emotional again and covered her face with her hand. Sandro looked around. But nowhere did he see his father. Staring at his now empty chair, he was about to ask his question, but his mother preempted him. "The treatment at the clinic was paid for by your father. He needs it now. He needs it now." The woman approached her son and gently pressed him to her chest. "Don't hold it against him, son. Everyone coped with grief as best they could." People waited for the cupcakes that Alejandro's mother hastily decided to bake. There weren't enough cups for everyone, and with awkward laughter, the woman had to ask their neighbors for some. After sorting out the family's life, which was going through a tragedy, sympathetic businessmen began to disperse, praising the hostess for her hospitality. They all promised to leverage their connections to expedite the search for the missing Serafina. Just 5 days later, her fate became known. A woman named Marcela Castillo lost her daughter in a terrible accident several years ago. Little Tio was a late, long-awaited child. Marcela's husband died shortly after their daughter's funeral. His heart couldn't bear such a blow. And Sonora Castillo's psyche couldn't cope with such grief. For many years, she concealed her sorrow from everyone, which resulted in the development of some severe mental disorders. Therefore, when she saw a girl on the street who remarkably resembled her deceased daughter, she couldn't distinguish reality from her illusions. She took little Fina, lured her into her car by deception, and took her to her modest home outside the city limits. This incident was so absurd that it was hard to believe it existed. The woman didn't let Fina out of the house, took away her phone, and monitored her every move, fearing that her daughter would disappear again. Throughout this time, Serafina was completely safe. Doctors didn't detect any problems other than the stress-induced psychosis. The woman was forcibly sent for treatment. The family was reunited. 2 more weeks passed. Father was discharged from the clinic, unable to hold back tears of joy and sincere gratitude to those who helped bring back his little girl. A year later, Sandro finally made friends with his classmates. Now they were studying in high school and often hung out together. They realized that a family's wealth does not determine a person's identity. Julio even asked Sandro to teach him how to properly strike. Little Fina recovered from the effects of the severe stress and became the cheerful and active girl she was before. And 5 years later, the family received an unexpected letter. In it, Marcela earnestly asked for forgiveness for that insane incident but also thanked them. The forced treatment helped her overcome her sorrow, and now she could call herself a healthy person. In her letter, she shared all the horrors she had to endure, describing the treatment process. The letter, line by line, descended into repeated apologies, and even so, through the paper, it was felt that this woman was no longer the Marcela Castillo whose madness led her to steal someone else's child. And in describing the results of therapy, she added that treatment allowed her to dare to enter into a new romance because there, at the clinic, she met a widower with whom they went through rehabilitation together from start to finish. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed the story, please support the video by liking it and leaving a comment. Thank you very much.